And now, you're tuned in to RBLR, the home of Tampa Bay's Reveler Sports.
Hello, everyone out there in the Tampa Bay area and beyond. This is James Knowles coming at you for the RBLR Sports Podcast, and I am here for the RBLR Rowdies show. This week, we are recording one day earlier than we usually do because we have a guest with us who is not based in the States, but has an interesting background in the soccer world and is somebody that we've been talking about for a couple of weeks building up to this interview. I'm very excited personally. This is someone that I've been reading for years, and I think that, you know, everybody is in for a treat listening to this. Our guest is going to be Ian Plenderleith. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump in. Ian, how are you doing today, and how's it been going for you recently?
Today I'm extremely knackered, to use a good English word, because I refereed two games, and the second game, quite typically for the games in my city, Frankfurt in Germany, ended with a mass brawl in the 89th minute, at which point I ended proceedings and pretty much left them all to it. But honestly, that is nothing unusual at all. But in generally, I'm in very good shape. Thank you very much for asking.
I didn't expect a mass brawl to be part of your answer. That's quite interesting.
Yeah, well, that's absolutely, I said to one of the club officials at the end, as he was showing me into my locker room and giving me my meager wages for the afternoon's work, I said, you know, the football culture in this city is completely messed up. And he just said, I couldn't agree with you more. That doesn't seem to be anything that anyone can do about it. This was a friendly game, I should add. We're just in the phase of coming to the end of the winter break, so the teams are preparing to start league play again. I even made a quip at the end of the game saying to the two teams, well, good thing this wasn't an important game, right? they were a little bit too. They were a little bit too intense and caught up in their own emotions to find any humor in the situation at all. But I don't really understand why a lot of these people actually play soccer and what they're getting out of it. They spent most of the afternoon screaming at each other, not at me, thankfully, which is apart from on one or two occasions, but sometimes the aggression and the emotions can be directed at me. Anyway, this is that's quite a good lead into the North American Soccer League, because one of the reasons why I'm fascinated by the first North American Soccer League is because it was a league where people seem to actually have fun. Now, I grew up in the 70s in the United Kingdom, and soccer was my main hobby and pastime, playing it, watching it. But it would be difficult to say that people in the 70s in Britain were enjoying their soccer. It'd be difficult to say that it was more sort of a duty to follow a team, and the more that you suffered through following your team, the greater was your badge of honor, in a way. And there was so much about soccer in the 70s in Europe, which is fascinating, historically fascinating. And there were some great players and some great teams and some great games, of course. But overall, the impression when you look back is and you compare it with today's game, glossy, hyped up game, it was a really gritty place to be. And at the time, I would read in soccer magazines, and my soccer magazines, they would have these photo features about this great thing in America, the North American Soccer League, where a lot of British players were playing. So, of course, they concentrated on those players wearing these outlandish, garish kits, surrounded by cheerleaders. But one of the most astonishing things was to see the people in the stands smiling and having fun. Like, what are they doing at a soccer game, having fun? I don't really get that. And of course, one of the prejudices we have always used to have in Britain about Americans was how damned happy and optimistic you could be. And growing up in grey Britain, in this kind of like the 70s, it would just seem to be full of snowstorms and strikes and I don't know. It was, again, your nostalgia or your backward glance is coloured by a few key events. But in terms of soccer, it was a lot of muddy pitches. Fans were penned into stadiums. They were not treated like anything other than sort of troublesome animals that had to be got in and out of the ground as quickly as possible before they wrecked it or started fighting each other. And again, that's a slightly exaggerated view of how things were, but it's also an overwhelming memory of going to games in the 70s. As it was you often had to really look out for yourself, and I think what a lot of British players really found when they came to America was they really loved the freedom, not necessarily the political freedom as such, but they loved the sort of daily freedom. And first of all, not really being recognized in the street because they weren't that famous in the US, but also just the freedom the league allowed them, that the North American Soccer League allowed them to express themselves. And a lot of what I wrote about in my book was about that this idea that soccer should be something you should enjoy playing it and you should enjoy watching it. And I think that's why when I was living in the United States as an adult, and I was writing a lot about soccer in America, and the North American Soccer League struck me as this forgotten league that people didn't really appreciate what an important part it had in US soccer history. And people say, well, the US doesn't have a soccer history, but it does. And even though it's a fragmented history, it's no less fascinating for that. And the North American Soccer League was for me just an absolute bomb of a league in several respects. But it's just like the way it brought together these superstars, and there's this particular era of the league from about 1975 to 1980, when the Rowdies, of course, were a huge part of the NASL, where this league was basically a forerunner of everything we experience about glamorous soccer today. The idea of having as many, the one particular league trying to get as many big names in there as possible, and entertaining as many fans as possible, rather than featuring results-oriented, ground-out, negative soccer, which in many parts of Europe had definitely become the norm during the 1970s.
So, all of that is, man, it's so much very interesting information to work with here. And you said that you first came across the North American Soccer League as it was back then through magazines and such. So now you've written a book about that. What really, beyond what you've talked about so far, what really fascinated you to the level that you were interested in writing not only a book about it, doing a history about it, but that, this is something that you have followed along from even back when it was, happening. And then later you turned and wrote the book, because obviously this was not done around the time that the league was going on, but you've got such a rich history with following the North American Soccer League. It's very interesting to me as someone who, I wasn't alive then, but it's also interesting that someone from abroad would be so interested in this.
Yeah, I was working for the website of the US soccer players, the National Team Players Association. And we used to throw around various feature ideas. And one of them was a regular US soccer history feature. And I wrote 2 or 3 pieces about the NASL, one about Team America, the strange experiment to have the US national team playing in the NASL, which lasted for 1 season. And I can't remember exactly what the other 2 features were about, but it did strike me that there was a huge and rich, untapped vein of stories in this league. And secondly, all the players and maybe some of the coaches too from that time were just reaching a kind of age in their 60s and the 70s where I think they're, with that perspective and that distance, where they're ready to talk about the league as it was and what happened with it. Now, so I talked to Alan Merrick, the former Minnesota Kicks player, for the piece about Team America, and he was very, very forthcoming and very easy to interview. A super nice guy, and that started me thinking there must be so many players from that era around about now. And the other thing that inspired me to write the book was the fact that nobody had written this book before, which I found very, very surprising, given how rich a topic it is, how interesting the league is, and how many stories there were out there still to be told. So once I started to talk to the players and some of the journalists, some of the team coaches involved, and even one of the former owners, and Dick Cecil of the Atlanta team, they would talk to me. Initially, most of them were very suspicious. I think a lot of the narrative about the NASL was very negative, and I think a lot of the people involved with it were a little bit defensive, because I thought, oh, here's just another hack. Some British guy is going to, he's just going to come up with a hatchet job for the league and say what a joke it was and what a disaster it was. And once we started chatting, and I started to say, no, I mean, I really actually, I'm totally fascinated by this league, and from what I see, everything I see about it, it had its faults, and it definitely had its ups and downs, but I completely love the whole idea of it, that it happened at all. So we would end up basically trying to get the players into my confidence, and then usually by the end of the interview, they would say, well, you should talk to A, B, and C, and they would put me in touch with other people as well. So that's how I think I'm fond of saying I didn't really write the book, but the 40 odd people that I talked to about the league who experienced it at the time, they are the ones that really wrote the book. I mean, they told me the stories, and all I really had to do was slot them into a narrative. And my book is not a complete, I explain in the introduction, it's not a complete history of the league. It doesn't cover every team and every game. I wanted it to be more of a historical analysis, to put the league into its place in time and say what a huge influence I think it had on soccer in Europe. You look at the NASL declined. It went bust in 1984, and then 6 years later you had the forming of the Premier League and the reformation of the European Champions Cup, which became the Champions League. And they took a lot of marketing ideas from America, probably not just from the NASL. I think they were looking at American sport in general as a way to appeal to fans, to get more fans in the stadium, to make it more friendly experience in the stadium. And the NASL was for me, it was absolutely, certainly a massive influence on what happened in the European game, for better and worse.
Well, I've heard a lot about, the time of, the dark time, so to speak, of British soccer in the 70s and the 80s, especially being a period of, a lot of hooliganism that then, I guess, through different governments, they needed to shut it down and really tamp down, make it more of an atmosphere that you can bring your family to, so to speak. And that has always seemed to be the great, the biggest aspect of Americans sport in general, actually, is that it's supposed to be an affair for the family, even if some people might get a little drunk sometimes, some people might get a little too antsy with their rival fans, but mostly it is supposed to be a good time for people to be able to bring their kids and such, and that wasn't always the case here. So is it something that you think was is that one of the bigger aspects of the NASL influence that you talk about, or what other examples might there be if that's not necessarily down to just the NASL, maybe American sport, as you said, but what other influences have you noticed from everything that you looked at in the NASL that has bloomed into other leagues around the world?
Certainly, I wouldn't necessarily use the word family, but certainly to appeal to a wider range of people and a wider range of fans. And one of the laments of British soccer is that it used to be a game for the working class people, and that a lot of people have been priced out of going to games because the tickets have become so expensive, which is a very unfortunate side effect, and it wasn't necessary. It didn't need to happen that way. Some people think soccer has become gentrified, that it's all seater stadiums now, and there's no atmosphere in the stadiums. If I can just quickly diverge off that, and there's a sort of contrast to that in Germany, where we still have standing sections, and my team Eintracht Frankfurt has one of the most incredible atmospheres in the stadium that I've ever experienced. Going to a home game here is just absolutely immense. But and from what I can understand, a lot of Premier League grounds nowadays is that they have got a little bit sterile. So the influence, when I talk about the influence, not necessarily always been a totally positive influence. And I think on the whole, though, going to watch a soccer game in England now compared with the 1970s is a broader experience, and you have more a far wider range of people going to watch you. I think having more women in the ground, having more children in the ground is very important, and I think that something definitely needed to be done on that. In terms of the NASL's influence on the game of the whole, I think that the way the game is marketed nowadays is aimed at pleasing people who watch it, and that sounds like a really dumb and obvious thing to say, but believe me, the British people did not have that attitude towards sport in the 1970s, especially in soccer. Nobody was really thinking there, like, how can we get more people into stadiums? They were thinking, how can we stop the people into stadiums like killing each other and wrecking what we have left of our pre-war structure, where the urinals are overflowing and the food is terrible, and pretty much everything about the experience is more stress than it is to do with leisure. And you think, this was like people's leisure time at the weekend. Why on earth would they spend their leisure time doing something that was not fun? But that's just us in Britain. We often like doing things that are not fun so we can complain about them afterwards. So other areas of influence, I think, like the way teams were built. And look at the Tampa Bay Rowdies team of the late 70s. You had players from England, Scotland, Argentina, a lot of South African players. You had homegrown American players, and that was very much a typical team for the NASL. They took the players. I think you had a player from Haiti and a couple of players from former Yugoslavia as well. And this was like almost very typical for almost every NASL team. Now you look at the makeup of European teams back then, and the Italian club teams were almost exclusively Italians. British teams exclusively Brits. German teams were exclusively German, almost exclusively. And this idea that you can actually look a little bit further than your own borders in order to build a team, I think that was out of necessity for the NASL, but I think that made people probably think. I think it was in the early 1980s, Tottenham Hotspur in England signed 2 Argentine players, and that was like a huge deal. Suddenly, Argentine players started coming to England in the early 1980s, and we were like, "Whoa, I want to see these guys." Well, no, they're from South America. There's going to be tricks and flair, and at that time there was still very much separate ways of playing in separate parts of the world. It's not the whole kind of generic tactical trends we get nowadays, where everybody's playing pressing one week and the following week everybody is following the trend. And so I think that was one of the magical things about the NASL. It's like the first truly multinational soccer league on earth, and that is now an absolute standard among every league in Europe, for example. I cannot think of even the sort of smaller leagues in places like Latvia or Lithuania. They still pick up players from who are coming from say the African subcontinent or from South or Central America, who are looking for a foot in the door to get into the European game. And so that's another way where I think the NASL was as I say, by necessity. It wasn't necessarily consciously doing that, but it was a definite forerunner, a big influence on the way the game has developed across the whole world.
That's incredibly interesting. I didn't think of it, in terms of obviously for America, yeah, it was a necessity because we didn't necessarily have the base to build out these teams in a way that would attract people to watch the game. So the fact that might have led to other teams realizing, oh, as you said, there are other countries that we can go and look in and possibly shop around some players. That's incredibly interesting. But unfortunately, another aspect of the NASL that I would like to get a lot more information from you, because you have obviously the historical base here with the NASL shuttering, and then for close to a decade, the American soccer landscape didn't necessarily have a first flight or a first tier that players could try to go and play in. And that led to, a lot of players who probably not necessarily slipped through the cracks, but didn't really have somewhere to go and play professionally that would help the national team and so on and so forth. So eventually Major League Soccer came along, and, they had to take all of the lessons from the NASL and make sure that they could build a league that would last in America. And it seems as though, from that time, they have done a very good job of it with, one or two hiccups that they ultimately did overcome in roughly the early 2000s. So what do you have to say on the shuttering of the NASL ultimately, and the influence that has, not just in America, but maybe if you've seen influences from the NASL shuttering on other leagues as well, where they have to take into consideration what happened here? If you could, give me your broad take, and then, like I said, any influences that you have picked up on in that aspect, I would be very interested to hear what you have to say for that.
It was interesting while I was researching the NASL. If you looked at the contemporary soccer press at the time, whether it was the independent press or whether it was the league's sanctioned magazine, Kick, there was this constant debate going on about the US player. Can we produce our own Pelé? Was the very simplified version of that narrative. But there was really this yearning to produce a generation of good American players, coupled with a complete lack of know-how about how to do this. So the dialogue was like, well, we need American players. Everybody knew that's the problem. We need American players. Nobody really knew how to get them. There was college soccer, which I think has been a bit of a millstone round the neck of the American game for a long time, and it's only now that you're really shaking that off. And I don't think college soccer has ever really been a very fertile ground for producing good American players, simply because by the time they leave college, it's too late. And I think college soccer is maybe too results oriented to develop players very well. And that's not me saying anything new at all. This debate was going back on already in the 1970s. And I think Major League Soccer has definitely taken a much better path when it comes to developing young players. And we've seen the results of that now for quite a long time. We're especially seeing the results now. If you look at the current American national team, it's very young, and it's got a lot of flair in it. And I think American players for a long time, the problem was that they were taught very technically and all within a club structure, and rather than the sort of spontaneous, like I guess could call street players you get from that come up through foreign countries where people generally play in a much less organized structure. than they do in the US. The US is very sort of almost by necessity of geography and the whole kind of suburban base of the game is very much based around practices and practice times and your allocated spot of the week when you play soccer. But I think that's starting to change now, and I think the fact that MLS clubs are obliged to develop players through their own academy now to some extent is a massive help in that respect. So I always say that MLS took the exam. I think I say this in the conclusion of my book. Actually, MLS took NASL as the example not to be followed. It was like the son of the drunken alcoholic father saying, "Well, I'm my dad is a big influence on me, and that I decided to follow the opposite path to him and do everything he taught me not to do, basically." That led to I think this was maybe what led to the slightly defensive attitude of some of the people I talked to start with, who felt that MLS has rejected out of hand like the entire league as a disaster and a catastrophe because it failed, and because in America, nobody treats failures as anything other than something to be handled with contempt. Whereas failures, to me, coming, as I say again, coming from Britain, failure is part of life for us, and we, in a way, we sort of almost revere failure more than we admire success. And I think that Major League Soccer, for all its successes, has been a little bit too dismissive and denigratory about the North American Soccer League, instead of embracing it as an important part of US soccer history.
Yeah, I think that I appreciate the sense that you're approaching it here as, it's not something that, like you said, it's not something that people should be looking down upon. It's just something that we need to look at and say, okay, whatever this thing is that worked, this part of it worked. And let's say, this other aspect of what the NASL did in this instance or circumstance, whatever it was, that did not work. So let's tweak that. Let's make that better. And I think that that's probably a better way to look at most things, because otherwise, yeah, unfortunately, you do get these opinions where people look down upon everything, and everything's bad, everything is awful, until someday, we emerge from the wilderness and this new American team. Everybody's kind of like, well, how did they come along? But I think that there's obviously a lot of background between the NASL, the people who are involved in the NASL making the MLS happen a little bit better, and then maybe MLS building up these academies to make these players. There's always history to support whatever's happening at the moment, whether that's a good or a bad thing. So I definitely appreciate your take on that. Do you see, and while we're on the American national team very quickly, do you see anything in particular that you would like to mention there? I am, as a fan of the American national team, I'm very excited to see that all of these players are doing well enough to get themselves, these big money moves in several instances to top European leagues. And that, that seems very exciting. Is that generally how you see it? Or, are there areas that need improvement in particular? Is there some overarching thing that maybe we are missing, just as the hyped, excited fans that we are?
I'm not that well placed to comment on the American national team because we don't get to see much of them over here, unfortunately. But the players that have been coming over and making an impression, in Germany especially, is Scully at Mönchengladbach, and Pulisic at Dortmund, and then at Chelsea, and Reina at Dortmund as well. These are giving Americans a tremendous reputation in Europe, whereas before, if you go back 20 years, it was all goalkeepers, and then maybe some good defenders like Steve Cherundolo was a long term player in the Bundesliga. So there's definitely a change in perception of the kind of players that America is producing now, and I think that's a fantastic thing for the US game and for the US national team. I think the previous World Cups, I think you look at US teams and a little bit like Australia, like they're always there and they always never really seem to make much impression on the tournament, or you don't really remember much about particular games or any fantastically outstanding players or great performances, bar maybe one or two of the games in the 2002 World Cup. And I hope that's something that's going to change, and we will see like a US team with a lot more character and personality and individual ways of expressing themselves, which is what I personally love about watching any soccer team, be it a club team or a country. And I think that's maybe one of the things that attracted me to the North American Soccer League too, was this emphasis on entertainment and flair and wanting players, encouraging players to have personality on and off the field. There's a lot of famous stories about off-field hijinks among NASL players. And I think the funny thing about that is a lot of it was kind of, conjured up by marketing departments who wanted to get their players' attention and into the media. And nowadays you have it the complete opposite, where the PR people are trying to cover up any misdemeanor that the player committed out of hours, because that's seen as damaging to his image and his sponsors and all the rest of it. Whereas in the 1970s, they wanted people out there, living the high life, players, whether they were Pelé or Chinaglia or Frank Worthington, who was a famous kind of playboy player in England, and he was typical of the kind of player that came to the NASL from Europe, in that he was a big time Charlie. He had a big open chest and the medallion and the scorer of lots of goals. Players like himself and George Best and Rodney Marsh, the players that really had a lot of panache about them, just a little bit of extra something. And I remember these players at the time, and we didn't have a lot of TV coverage in the UK in the 1970s. There was like two games were highlighted per week. And a lot of what you saw or heard came from reading soccer magazines and just what you talked about in the playground at school. You would imitate these players because you'd heard that they scored a lot of goals. You wouldn't even necessarily have seen them, but word got around that these are the players that are interesting, and a lot of them were getting kicked out of the game because they like to turn on skills. They like to go out drinking, and they like to miss training, and they like to be a showman on the field, and that didn't go down with many coaches at all, or any coaches at all. So when they came to America, they were like, okay, here's my chance to really be the ultimate showman and the top showman in the team, and to enjoy myself a bit and relax and not feel this constant pressure like you've got to get results. Because I think the priority of the NASL was really to try and grow the game in the US and grow the game, grow the league, establish soccer, rather than necessarily concentrating about who actually won the title. I think that was of secondary importance to most of the teams that started up in the NASL.
That's all very interesting. While we're still on that bit about the NASL, are there any thoughts you have about the players at the time who were kind of like that maybe they felt stifled in let's say Britain, or if it was somewhere else, and they wanted to come over and they wanted to showcase themselves? Were there any instances of that? Were there any and this is up to you, I don't know if this is something you would like to get into outside of having people read your book, but are there any let's say colorful anecdotes of players, being off the field and being able to experience what life was like when they weren't so in the eye of the public and when they came over to play here?
Yeah, I think a lot of the British players I talked to were just enjoyed the general feeling of being like a kind of a bit of a personality in town. I think I remember Jeff Barnett, the goalkeeper who used to play for Arsenal and then went on to play for the Minnesota Kicks. Jeff talked about being a bit of a lad around town and having the attentions of lots of women thanks to his accent and being a sort of a minor star. the title of the book, Rock and Roll Soccer, was kind of ironic because I felt that whole I guess Playboy side to it was a little bit overemphasized, especially as people just talked about the Cosmos a lot of the time whenever they talked about the NASL. And, Pele, Chinaglia, Beckenbauer are all going to Studio 54 and Warner Brothers, big entertainment budgets, sex on the charter flight, blah, blah, blah. And when you actually talk to a lot of the players who were at the Cosmos in the 70s, they said, this is just nonsense. A little bit of that probably happened to the top players, but, we were just like, we went and trained hard every day and we took it really seriously. And then we'd drive home at night and they lived out somewhere beyond Brooklyn. And they didn't really have the time or the opportunity to go to Studio 54 every night. They were just like honest professional players who were there to do their best and make a living and experience the joys of living somewhere different in another country. And I think what a lot of people really appreciated, and this is something I could speak of from personal experience, is coming to live in America and a completely different cultural experience, like the different attitudes to space, the different possibilities it offers in terms of your professional life, of the number of places you can go and reach, and the different landscapes you can experience. I think that for people coming from Britain, there's the guy who came from Middlesbrough, who played in Minnesota, whose name Alan Willie. He told me, he never even left Middlesbrough when he flew to America. He had no idea where he was flying to. He had no idea where Minnesota was. And he gets off a plane and he's on these interstates with like 5-lane highways going in each direction. It's unlike anything he's ever seen in the north of England. And to us in the 70s, American culture was TV detective shows and shows like the Fonz. It was definitely sort of a glamorous, not even necessarily glamorous, just like this, something completely different, but something awesome. We thought everybody, a lot of Brits look down and notice that Americans, like the way they talk, they have different accents to us, and they're always cheerful and happy and optimistic. It's extremely hypocritical. On the other hand, everybody somehow comes to me. I don't know anybody who comes to America and says it's terrible here. It's like they're like eyes are open the whole time. It's just incredible. It's incredible. Look at everything they have here. And then that fascination. It definitely goes back to all the way back to World War II and maybe even earlier. This absolutely stupendously other culture compared with the restrictive kind of grayness of Britain, especially in the 1970s, where you still had a sort of like colonial hangover, attitudes of elite who all went to Oxford and Cambridge and the big private schools who were still running the country back then and are still running the country today. This reverence for royalty and respect for people with titles. And all of that goes out the window when you come to America, and everybody just tells you, puts you in your place and tells you how things really are. At the same time, having this sort of disarming politeness and interest in you, and this desire to talk to you, which took me a year or two to get used to when I first came to America in 1999. By the time I left 15 years later, I was just as garrulous as your average American, like talking to people on the street. I came back to Germany and find people giving me very funny looks when I just go up and start talking to them. We don't do that in Europe. No. Don't show you're interested in anybody. They think you're after something. I don't know if I've gone anywhere close to answering your question there. I completely wandered off topic. I apologize for that.
No, it's definitely related to what we're talking about, and I appreciate the anecdotes as well. But it's definitely funny talking about the differences in culture, including the talking to strangers thing, because my dad was born in Scotland and then he was raised in Canada and moved here to America, and now he is that garrulous American who would be talking to the strangers everywhere he goes. And I'm sure, as it happens, we are going to Germany in July, and I'm sure that we're going to be on the receiving end of some of those inquisiting looks, just like, what are you after here, man? Why are you talking to me like this? And it'll be very interesting to see how it goes. But yeah, I'm looking forward to the trip, not only to get over there, but yeah, it's going to be really cool to also embrace that cultural difference that you're referring to. If we can talk for a second about, and I've appreciated everything you've talked about. You've been so generous with your time and talking about the NASL. But if I can ask you about a couple more things that are, modern issues. What is your favorite league to watch right now, and why would you say that that's your favorite league to watch? I don't know if that's part of your living in Germany is covering stuff, or if that's for work, but maybe that's part of maybe the soccer culture is part of it. What is your favorite league, your favorite culture and fan base, all of that kind of stuff? Just give me a good list of recommendations for stuff to try to take in.
In terms of what I go to see live in the stadium, pandemic aside, I love watching games in Germany. There's just I mentioned earlier that the atmosphere at Eintracht Frankfurt is absolutely tremendous, and I did live here once briefly in the 1990s and became a fan of the team then. So it was coming back to support them has given me a lot of pleasure, and it's very rarely boring to watch Eintracht because they're either terrible or they're incredible. They really put you through the emotional ringer, and one week they'll have you thinking that they're absolute dead cert to be the next Bundesliga champions, which they haven't actually been since the late 1950s. And next week you think they're absolute dead cert to go down to Division 2 because they're so abject. So in that case, they're kind of a classic team for a British fan, because you're constantly in this like emotional cycle where you never really know whether to love them or hate them. So unfortunately, the Bundesliga is so uncompetitive with the dominance of Bayern Munich that it's hard to recommend it as a whole league. Going to watch games live, I love watching them on television. Seeing Bayern Munich head towards their 10th consecutive title is no fun at all. A league I'm really enjoying watching right now at the moment is the English League One, which we used to know in my days as the third division. That's where my hometown team, Lincoln City, play. And thanks to the wonders of technology, I can subscribe to an internet feed so I can watch all their games live, which my family will tell you is a very loud and sometimes distressing experience for them, and they worry about the other people in the building complaining. But I've actually been really amazed by the quality of the games I've been watching on there recently. I mean, lower division English soccer has a reputation for being a lot of kicking it and lumping it and super fast, but with very poor technique. But that is something else that's definitely changed over the last few years. And I watch some Lincoln games now, and even though we're kind of struggling towards the bottom of that division, just some really exciting games to watch and with great quality of play. And I think that's a little bit true of the Championship, the English second tier as well. There's a lot of teams there that are technically very good and exciting to watch. And the good thing about these two particular divisions is they're close. They're very closely fought. A lot of you don't get any bad teams, really. I mean, Lincoln have played some struggling teams this season, but you wouldn't know. You only know they're struggling from their league position. You watch the actual game, and there's nobody really where you would think that they should be on the end of a hammering, or they should definitely be getting relegated. There's no really poor teams anymore. And what I like about that, compared with all the top flights, is that kind of egalitarian spread. And you look at, I mentioned the Bundesliga, you look at England, Italy, France especially, Paris Saint-Germain walking away with the title. In Spain, there are only 3 teams that are going to win the title. It's pretty much top heavy towards the teams that get regular Champions League money and income and can afford to attract the best players. That's a market mechanism that's gone wrong for soccer, in my opinion. The reform of the Champions League back in the 90s, and a lot of people predicted this at the time, was going to make the domestic leagues less interesting. So the positive knock-on effect is that the lower divisions, and look at the second division in Germany as well. Actually, I love that's another league I would recommend if you can see that. That's really, really tight division. So 18 teams, 3 go up potentially, 3 go down potentially if you factor in the playoffs. So there's very little margin. You go on a good run and you're suddenly up in the promotion positions. You go on a bad run, you're suddenly in danger of relegation. And the second division in Germany, of course, there's a lot of really big ex-Bundesliga teams, really big names in there right now, like Hamburg and Bremen and Nuremberg, Hanover, and Schalke, of course, who I momentarily forgot because it's hard for me to reconcile with the idea of that team being in the second division. So that's, for me, is a very fascinating side effect of the top-heavy wealth in the game. It's made the top divisions really dull, frankly, and predictable. Whereas if you go down to the professional league, second and third level, they're very close and much more exciting. The unfortunate thing for those teams is that their reward is promotion to the Premier League, which of course brings you lots of attention, lots of money, but you're not going to have a chance to win it. You're just going to be in there to struggle and survive and say, yeah, well, we were there. We were in the Premier League for a couple of seasons. Last season, Lincoln City almost got promoted to the Championship. We were in the playoff final, which we lost at Wembley to Blackpool. Did not upset me anything like as much as I thought it would, because I kind of worry. Lincoln City have never in my lifetime been a second-tier club, and I just don't know if they're big enough to survive it. What would happen if we go up? We go up and we have a really miserable season where we lose nearly every game. I would much rather be a solid team in a competitive league than a struggling team in a league that where we're a little bit out of our depth, because there's just too many clubs, for example, come down from the Premier League with their wealth that comes with the parachute payments that they get from that. So that's another long and verbose answer to your very straightforward question about which leagues I like to watch. I do occasionally.
No, that's great.
I do admit I do like the odd Italian game. There's something about Serie A which has just always attracted me a little bit. Just I probably don't even want to admit it. I don't even particularly like any Italian clubs. I'd love to see Italian clubs losing in European competition, because on my memory of growing up with European competition, the Italians are always terrible losers, terrible sports. But in a way, everyone's come to respect the way the Italians hate losing. It's just it's not something I apply to the way I always played soccer. I never really cared much whether I won or lost. But the way the Italians approach the game is something I kind of admire about their will to win, or their desire to win. I should put it.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned the second divisions. I try to catch a lot of European soccer games specifically related to the U.S. national team. So when I can find games on the platforms that we have that show teams where Americans are playing, then that's usually the game that I'll try to watch. And it's very funny. Last year in May, I was watching Greuther Fürth try to win promotion to Bundesliga in the last promotion playoff spot, and I cannot remember at this point whom they were playing, but the stadium was empty. all of the fans were outside the gate trying to see how it's going. And the Greuther Fürth originally, I think they took the lead, then they gave up the lead, and then they went, and then it was 2-1 to the other team. Then I believe that team had a player sent off. Greuther Fürth tied it back up at 2-2. And if I'm not mistaken, all of this, then they went on to win 3-2. And it was the most back and forth, up and down game I've seen in ages. And I just remember them all going to celebrate with the fans who were standing outside the gates of the stadium because they weren't allowed in because of COVID. And I was, cheering for Julian Green, who plays for Greuther Fürth, so that he could get into the Bundesliga, and they haven't been doing so well now. But it was, it was just such an exciting game, and there was so much on the line. Obviously, the passion involved, even without the people literally feet away from the field, but outside, it was amazing to see. But it's a very interesting way to look at things. For my last question for you here, I want to, we'll talk about your book as well very quickly, but for the people listening, are there any other recommendations that you would give to, follow up with anything? I had previously John Morrissey on our podcast. He is at USL Tactics on Twitter, and he does the tactical side. He recommended Spiel for Lagerung, which is it's a tactics blog, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with that one, but are there any other things, like I said, other than yourself, before we get to that you would recommend people possibly look into?
That's one question that's just going to stump me, I'm afraid. I must admit, I tend to avoid soccer media, even though I'm part of it, because I'm sometimes worried that it's going to affect what I write, or it's going to maybe block up ideas of my own. So the way I get inspired to write about soccer is from basically participating in it as an active coach and as a referee, which takes up a lot of my time, and then by watching too many games, probably too many leagues, and I honestly, as soon as the post-match interviews start, I either mentally switch off, or I switch off the set, or I switch over to another game. I'm not that interested. I'm not that interested in hearing people talk about soccer. I'd much rather be kind of in it rather than analyze. I think maybe a lot of the tactical stuff, I'll be absolutely frank here, I'm a bit of a Luddite when it comes to tactics. I think there are some very simple ways to play soccer, which I try to instill into my youth teams as a coach, and I think that a lot of it's become too, I'm not saying overcomplicated, because I think there are obviously some very clever analyses out there of the way the game is played, and I think if you're working in those areas at the top level, then they're probably absolutely fascinating to me as a writer, as a fan, as a coach, as a referee. I'm not particularly interested in that side of the game. I'm more interested in the character of the teams and the players, their social position in where does the history of the team, where does a team stand in relationship to the town and the people who go to watch it, where does that team stand in relationship to its sponsors or its owners, or how do the players react to human rights questions. So something I've been hugely keeping an eye on the last few years is FIFA and the awarding of World Cups to states where human rights are oppressed and where there is not the requisite amount of media freedom to cover these events properly. So, for example, I pretty much boycotted the 2018 World Cup and didn't watch it. Not that anybody noticed my boycott, but it's interesting that 2022 World Cup in Qatar has attracted a much bigger movement in favor of boycotting it, and especially in Germany, there's been a lot of protest about that. So I'm keeping an eye on that movement, because I think the plan is to sort of stage alternative events. And what I did in 2018 was I just withdrew to a house that had no internet or television, and tried to ignore the tournament, but which proved in the end very difficult. I started tuning in on the radio by around the quarterfinal stage. But I think with Qatar, people are really not excited about this World Cup for a number of reasons. Most of them are non-soccer reasons, and it's going to be interesting to see how that debate shapes up. I think FIFA has come under a lot of scrutiny, rightly so, in the last few years, and I hope that we can continue that scrutiny and continue to try and push for change in the way that the game is run from the top all the way down. And I experienced that just on a very local level here, and being involved with a local soccer club in Frankfurt, being involved in the referee scene and how referees are treated and how the disciplinary process works. All these things are tied up with the way that these bodies are undemocratically elected, appointed, and are unaccountable. And I think that's the big future discussion point for soccer. And for me, that's very interesting to cover that and write about that.
Well, I agree with just about everything you've said there, but if people then want to follow up with you, I know you said you don't have, you don't try to follow soccer media. So if people are trying, or as it is, but if people try to follow you, where can they go to get your book and support you the most? I read you on Soccer America. I don't know if that's likely the best place to find your stuff or to support your work, but where can people find your book and where can people find your articles?
Well, my books are at the usual places on Amazon, unfortunately, although there are independent booksellers who sell them. So my first book, which has pretty much disappeared off the face of the earth, was actually a collection of soccer fiction called For Whom the Ball Rolls. My book about the North American Soccer League is called Rock and Roll Soccer, The Short Life and Fast Times of the North American Soccer League. You can still get that online pretty much everywhere. It was published in the US by St. Martin's Press in New York. And I'm kind of happy that people are still interested in it, because it's being a sort of historical work. It hasn't aged really much at all. Maybe in a discussion at the end about Major League Soccer a little bit, but nothing's going to change about the history of a league that ended in 1984.
Right.
Another place you can find me is I write a blog about my refereeing experiences. I started it about 5.5 years ago as a way to work off my frustrations at being an amateur referee in a very fraught footballing, very fraught soccer culture. And I was surprised, first of all, it started from a base of 0, and I was surprised how interested people were in it and how many stories continue to be told through it. I thought it would kind of get repetitive, but it has actually taken off quite well. It's called Referee Tales. It's on one of these, it's just on a very typical blog space, refereetales.blogspot.de. But you can follow it on the account on Twitter is @refereetales. And that is actually, that blog will be published later this year in book form. I've just come to a deal with a small and very attractively passionate UK soccer book publisher. We're just working on the final script of that now, so that will hopefully coming out in the summer.
Awesome. Well, we will include that link in the description, and this book coming out. I think I actually have a friend who would appreciate more than any other thing I've ever given them. So I'm gonna keep my eye out for that. But Ian, I have taken up so much of your time, and you've been so gracious with answering all of these questions. And believe me, I appreciate all of these answers. They were not long-winded or anything. This is awesome stuff for me, and I hope our listeners value it as much as I do. But personally, even if they don't like it, I've enjoyed this conversation so much. So thank you again for taking all this time to talk with us today. And I can tell you that I will be looking out for more of your stuff in the future. And do they also have, or do you also have a personal Twitter account that people can follow you?
Yes, it's my name in reverse. So it's at Plenderleith Ian. If you want to read the odd acerbic aside about the British government, that's probably that's what you'll find on there. I tend to concentrate a little bit more on the referees account these days, because it seems to be growing, and because abuse of referees and referee shortages in Germany and in the UK is a very big issue right now. So it's taking on a slightly political aspect. Yeah.
Gotcha.
And thank you for having me on. It's always a pleasure to talk about soccer and the NASL and America especially. I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Well, yeah, like I said, it's been an honor. I appreciate it so much. So thank you again.
Thank you for tuning into this presentation by RBLR Sports. On your way out of the stadium, please remember to like and subscribe.